Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe to watch our next video. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe to watch our next video.
Thanks for watching. Follow a brighter destiny for more powerful stories, and don't forget to subscribe.
Ma'am, that seat's taken. The words came out low, steady, almost gentle, but they landed in the cabin like a dropped glass. Diane Whitfield didn't turn her head. She didn't even blink. She just adjusted the cream cashmere wrap around her shoulders and kept scrolling through her phone. As if the man standing in the aisle were a flight delay notification she could simply swipe away. Elijah Cross stood there in a charcoal hoodie, gone soft at the elbows, jeans faded pale at the knees, work boots scuffed at the toes from 20 years of use. He held a boarding pass in one hand and a canvas to full in the other, and he did not move. It was 6:52 in the morning at Denver International, Gate B-15, and Flight 2207 to Nashville was boarding early because a storm system was rolling in from the west. Nobody wanted to sit on the tarmac waiting it out. The cabin lights in first class were already dimmed to that soft amber that makes 6 in the morning feel later than it is. A man in a gray suit sipped orange juice 2 rows up and didn't look over. A woman near the window had her earbuds in and her eyes closed, pretending the way people do that stillness makes you invisible. Elijah looked down at the boarding pass again. Seat 2A. He had bought it 3 days ago in a hurry after a phone call from his sister that had made his hands shake so badly he'd had to set the phone down on the kitchen counter before he could dial the airline back. His mother had fallen in her driveway in Nashville, broken hip surgery in 6 hours. He hadn't packed more than a change of clothes, and his father's old steel wristwatch, the one graved on the back with 2 letters, and a year that meant something only to him. "I have a ticket for this seat," he said again, quieter this time, because raising his voice had never once in his life gotten him anywhere good. "I think there's been a mix-up." Diane finally looked up, and when she did, her eyes moved the way eyes move when they've already made a decision and are only pretending to gather evidence. Down the hoodie, down the jeans, down the boots. Back up to his face, holding there just long enough to be an insult. "There's no mix-up," she said. "I always fly this route. They know me here." A flight attendant named Grace Malone appeared at the end of the aisle, the kind of practice calm on her face that comes from years of smoothing over things that shouldn't need smoothing. Her name tag caught the amber light. Behind her, 3 more passengers filed in, slowing, then stopping when they registered the tension blocking the road, the way traffic slows for an accident nobody wants to look at but can't help watching. "Is everything all right here?" Grace asked, and her voice had that particular brightness people use when they already suspect it isn't. "This gentleman seems confused about his seat," Diane said smoothly, folding her hands over her phone. "I don't think he's supposed to be up here at all, honestly." Elijah felt that sentence land somewhere behind his ribs, in the place where old bruises live even after the skin has healed over. He had heard versions of it his whole life, at the loading dock where he'd started 22 years ago, with a work permit and a borrowed truck. In boardrooms years later, where a security guard once asked to see his badge 3 separate times in one afternoon while his white colleagues walked past unquestioned. He knew the shape of that sentence the way you know the shape of your own hand in the dark. "I'm not confused," he said. "My mother is in a hospital in Nashville. I need this seat because it's mine." He held the boarding pass out, not pushing it, just letting it exist in the space between them. "Grace, may I see it?" she asked, and he handed it over without a word. She read it. He watched her read it. "Seat 2A, Nashville, paid in full." He watched the small flicker of recognition cross her face, the moment when the truth sits there plain and undeniable, and everyone in the room can see it land. Then he watched her glance toward Diane, and something in that glance made his stomach tighten, because he had seen that hesitation before, too. It was the look of someone doing math that had nothing to do with fairness. "Ma'am, could I see your boarding pass as well?" Grace asked, and Diane sighed, the specific sigh of someone who considers a request itself to be a form of disrespect. She pulled it up on her phone and turned the screen just enough for Grace to see. Grace's eyes moved across it, and this time there was no flicker. There was just a long, uncomfortable pause because the screen said 4C, and everyone within 3 rows could see it too. Well, Diane said quickly before Grace could speak. Obviously, there's been some kind of system error, because I specifically requested this row when I booked. Grace's mouth opened, then closed. A man in the gray suit 2 rows up finally looked over the top of his tablet. A teenager across the aisle lowered her phone half an inch, just enough to angle the camera without looking like she was doing it. The cabin had gone quiet in that particular way. Cabins go quiet when nobody wants to be the one who says something, but nobody wants to look away either. Ma'am, Grace said carefully, your ticket shows 4C. This gentleman's ticket shows 2A. I think the simplest thing, Diane interrupted, would be for him to just take a seat in coach where there's clearly room, and let the rest of us get where we're going on time. She said it lightly, almost kindly, the way people say cruel things when they've convinced themselves that saying them nicely makes them not cruel at all. Elijah didn't answer right away. He looked past her, out the small oval window, at the ground crew moving beneath the wing in the gray morning light baggage cart, riding by, loaded with suitcases that belonged to people whose right to be exactly where they were sitting had never once been questioned. Then he looked back at Diane, and something in his face had gone very still. I've spent a lot of years being told to go find somewhere else, he said. Not always on a plane. Sometimes it was a restaurant. Sometimes it was a bank. Once it was my own unsupported. He paused. I'm 51 years old. I bought this seat 3 days ago with my own money because my mother is in surgery this afternoon, and I need to be there when she wakes up. I am not moving. The word landed and stayed. Diane's jaw tightened. Grace's grip on the boarding pass went white at the knuckles. Behind them, the line of boarding passengers had backed up into the jet bridge, and somewhere a suitcase wheel bumped twice against the floor, loud in the sudden quiet. I'll need to get my supervisor, Grace said finally, and turned toward the curtain that separated first class from the galley, her steps quicker than they needed to be. She came back 90 seconds later with a man named Todd Pierce, the in-flight service, the clipboard tucked under one arm, and the specific posture of someone who had resolved 100 small disputes and assumed this would be the 101st. He looked at Elijah first, taking in the hoodie, the jeans, the boots, and something in his face closed before he'd even heard a single fact. Sir, he said, we're going to need you to step out of the row so we can sort this out without holding up boarding. I have the correct ticket, Elijah said. I'm not the one who needs sorting out. Todd's expression tightened. Sir, I understand you're frustrated, but I'm not frustrated, Elijah said, and his voice hadn't risen at all, hadn't so much as wavered. I'm telling you a fact. Seat 2A, my name, my ticket. Ask her for hers again if you'd like. It says 4C. Todd looked at Diane. Diane looked back at him with the particular composure of a woman who has never once in her life had to defend her right to occupy space. Todd exhaled slowly, and Elijah watched him make the same calculation Grace had made, the same one he'd watched dozens of people make over the years, weighing which kind of trouble was easier to have. The kind where you inconvenience the woman in the cashmere wrap, or the kind where you inconvenience the man in the hoodie who wasn't raising his voice, and therefore foreign quiet, unspoken part of Todd's mind, wasn't a real problem yet. Here's what I'd propose, Todd said, addressing Elijah now, his tone gone smooth and procedural. We move you to seat 14C, which is a perfectly comfortable seat. We refund the difference, and we all get where we're going without further delay. You're asking me to move out of my own seat, Elijah said, so the woman won't have to. I'm asking you to help us keep this flight on schedule, Todd said. Elijah looked at him for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised everyone watching, which by now was most of the first-class cabin, and a good portion of the passengers craning to see over the curtain from coach. He reached into the duffel bag at his feet, unhurried, and pulled out a slim leather folder. He opened it, drew out a single business card, and held it out not to Todd, but to Grace. Would you mind calling this number? He said quietly. Ask for Renata. Tell her Elijah is on flight 2207, and there's a seating issue in row 2. Grace took the card. Her eyes moved over it once, twice, and something in her face changed the way inches right before it cracks, a stillness right before the break. She looked up at him, then down at the card again, then back at him. Sir, she said, her voice smaller now. Is this just make the call? Elijah said gently. Please. She disappeared behind the curtain. The cabin waited. Diane crossed her arms and muttered something about theatrics under her breath, loud enough to be heard, quiet enough to pretend she hadn't meant it that way. Todd stood in the aisle, with his clipboard held a little too tightly against his chest, glancing every few seconds toward the galley curtain like a man waiting for a verdict he had already started to suspect wouldn't go his way. 3 minutes passed. In an airplane cabin at 6 in the morning with a storm rolling in from the west, 3 minutes is a very long time. A businessman 2 rows up quietly typed a name into his phone's search bar and watched his own eyebrows rise as the results loaded. He leaned toward the woman beside him and murmured something, and she leaned in to look at his screen, and her hand came up to cover her mouth. Grace came back through the curtain, and she was not alone. Behind her walked a man in his early 60s with silver at his temples and 4 gold stripes on his shoulders, the unmistakable posture of a captain who had spent 30 years learning how to walk into a tense room and take control of it without raising his voice. Captain Owen Miller. He took one look at the row, at Elijah standing calm and still, at Diane seated with her arms crossed, at Todd holding his clipboard like a shield, and something in his expression sharpened. "What's the situation?" he asked, though it was clear from his tone that Grace had already told him most of it on the walk up the aisle. "This man is disputing the seating arrangement," Todd began, but the captain held up a hand without looking at him. "Ma'am," he said, turning to Diane, "your boarding pass, please." She handed it over with visible irritation. He studied it for a second, then looked at Elijah's. "Yours as well." Elijah handed his over too. Miller looked at both cards for a long moment, then handed them back, his jaw set. "Ma'am, this pass says 4C, he said. "Sir, this pass says 2A. There isn't a dispute here." "There's a mistake, and it isn't his." Diane's mouth opened to argue, but before she could, the intercom near the gal crackled and a new voice came through it, calm, clipped, unmistakably used to being listened to the first time. "This is Walter Briggs speaking. I understand there's a situation in row 2. I'd like everyone to remain exactly where they are for the next 2 minutes." The cabin went utterly silent. Todd's face drained of color so fast it was almost visible in real time. Grace's hand came up to her collarbone. Captain Miller straightened his shoulders. The way a man straightens when he realizes the ground beneath him has just shifted in a direction he did not anticipate. "Who's Walter Briggs?" The teenager across the aisle whispered to her mother, and her mother, who had grown up in Nashville and had flown this airline for 15 years, went very pale and said quietly, "That's the CEO." The forward door of the aircraft, which had been closed for boarding just minutes earlier, opened again. Ground staff at the jet bridge could be heard exchanging quick words with someone outside. Footsteps came up the aisle, unhurried, the particular walk of a man who has never in his adult life needed to move fast for anyone. Walter Briggs stepped into the first-class cabin in a dark suit with no tie, reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, and his eyes went immediately, unmistakably, to Elijah. "Mr. Cross," he said, "I am so sorry. I got the call 2 minutes ago and I came straight down." The words moved through the cabin like something physical. Diane's arms slowly uncrossed. Todd's clipboard lowered an inch. The businessman 2 rows up leaned forward, so far he nearly spilled his orange juice. Elijah nodded once. "It's fine, Walter," he said. "It's handled now." "It is not fine," Walter said, and turned to face the row, his voice carrying easily through the quiet cabin. Elijah Tross founded this airline in a rented hangar outside Memphis with 1 cargo plane and 4 employees 22 years ago. He is the majority shareholder of Cross Aviation Holdings, which owns this airline outright. He flew out an escort or an announcement on purpose because he wants to know what this airline actually feels like for the people who fly it, not the version we perform when we know he's watching. He turned to Diane, "And you told him to find another seat." Diane's face had gone through several colors in the space of 10 seconds, and none of them were good ones. "I didn't know who he was," she said, and her voice had lost every ounce of its earlier certainty. "You didn't need to know," Elijah said quietly, and it was the first time his voice had carried any real weight in it since the confrontation began. "You needed to look at a boarding pass. You needed to treat a stranger like a person before you decided he wasn't worth the trouble. But that's all it ever takes. It never once required knowing my name." Walter turned to Todd next, and his voice, still calm, had an edge to it now that made the younger man visibly flinch. You offered to move the correct ticket holder out of his confirmed seat to unaccommodate someone in the wrong one. That's not a customer service failure, Todd. That's a policy failure, and it's one we're going to look at very closely. Sir, I was just trying to keep things moving, and Todd started, but Walter was already turning it, and the sentence died in the air unfinished, the way excuses do when the person they're aimed at has already stopped listening. Grace stood near the curtain, her hands folded in front of her, watching all of it with an expression Elijah recognized immediately, because he had worn it himself more than once in his life. It was the look of someone realizing, in real time, that they had gone along with something they knew wasn't right, and that going along with it quietly was its own kind of choice. Ma'am, Walter said, turning back to Diane, we're going to need you to move to your assigned seat now. Diane stood slowly, gathering her tote bag with hands that weren't quite steady. She paused beside Elijah for a moment, and something flickered across her face that might have been the beginning of shame, though it was hard to tell whether it was for what she'd done or simply for having been caught doing it. I really am sorry, she said quietly. I wasn't trying to be, and she stopped, because there wasn't a way to finish that sentence that didn't make things worse. You were trying to be exactly what you were, Elijah said, not unkindly, just honestly. You looked at me for 4 seconds and decided I didn't belong here. That decision doesn't go away just because it turned out to be wrong about my bank account. It would have been just as wrong if I'd been exactly who you assumed I was. She had nothing to say to that. She moved down the aisle to row 4 without another word. The cabin watched her go the way a cabin watches anything it will talk about for the rest of the flight and long after it lands. Elijah sat down in seat 2A. His hands rested on the armrests, and for a moment he simply breathed, looking out at the gray Denver morning, at the ground crew finishing their work beneath the wing, at a world that had almost once again told him to disappear. Word of what had happened moved through the plane faster than the plane itself would move once it left the ground. 2 rows back, an older man leaned toward his wife and said, "Lo, I used to work loading docks for a shipping company outside Memphis back in the 90s. Fella built that whole operation up from nothing, treated every one of us the same, driver or foreman, didn't matter." Never once heard him raise his voice. Guess some things don't change. 3 rows further, a young flight attendant in training, seated as a passenger on her way to a new base assignment, quietly opened her laptop and began typing a report she planned to file the moment she landed, a request that the airline's seating dispute protocol be reviewed from top to bottom, because she had just watched with her own eyes exactly how badly it could fail someone who had done nothing wrong. The flight took off 40 minutes late, and nobody in first class complained about the delay, not once. Not even under their breath. 2 hours into the flight, at cruising altitude with the clouds stretched flat and white beneath them, Grace came down the aisle with a glass of water and set it gently on the tray in front of Elijah Al without being asked. She lingered a moment. I should have believed the ticket, and I said, instead of hesitating. I keep going over it in my head and I can't figure out why I hesitated at all. Elijah looked up at her. You hesitated because it's easier to disappoint the person who won't make a scene, he said. That's not an excuse, it's just the truth, and it's worth sitting with. If you sit with it long enough, you stop doing it. She nodded slowly, and something in her face suggested she meant to. By the time the plane began its descent into Nashville, the story had already left the aircraft in the way stories do now, quietly, in messages sent from seatback distance, in a video the teenager across the aisle had recorded, without quite realizing what she was capturing until she watched it back. Somewhere over Kentucky, a corporate account belonging to Cross Aviation Holdings received an internal flag requesting an urgent review of gate and cabin crew protocols nationwide. Somewhere in a legal office in Memphis, a paralegal opened a new file. None of it happened loudly. All of it happened. 3 weeks later, Elijah sat in a small conference room at the Airline's Memphis headquarters, not at the head of the table, though everyone in the room understood he could have sat anywhere he chose. Across from him sat 3 people he had asked to be brought in specifically. A gate agent from the Atlanta hub, a former flight attendant named Priya Anand, who explained why she eventually left the airline after being told repeatedly to seat certain passengers away from what one supervisor had called sensitive customers, a phrase that had never once, in 3 years, been applied to a white passenger. And a retired baggage handler named Otis Reeves, 71-year-old, who spoke quietly about being passed over for a supervisor's role sometimes in favor of younger, less experienced white employees, and about how he had simply stopped applying after the 4th time, not because he'd given up, but because he'd run out of reasons to believe the outcome would be different. Elijah listened to every word without interrupting once. When Otis finished, the room was quiet for a long moment, and then Elijah spoke. "I built this company because I was tired of being told there wasn't room for people like me," he said. "And somewhere along the way, without meaning to, I let this company become a place that told other people the exact same thing. That's on me as much as it's on anyone in this room. It stops all now, not as a policy on paper, but as something we actually mean." Todd Pierce was terminated 11 days later, not for a single incident. The internal review made it clear, but for a documented pattern of deference towards status and appearance that had shown on up in 4 separate passenger complaints over the preceding 2 years, 2 complaints that had been logged and quietly closed without action each time. Diane Whitfield, whose full name and employer had surfaced publicly within 72 hours of the video spread, resigned her purpose and mid-sized real estate firm in Atlanta after several of the company's largest clients, 3 of whom were black-owned businesses she had personally handled, requested new account managers within the same week. The firm never publicly confirmed the reason. It never needed to. 6 months later, every gate agent, flight attendant, and service manager at Cross Aviation Holdings completed a mandatory training program built directly on the testimony of people like Mark Webb, Anand, and Otis Reeves, a program that did not treat bias as an abstract concept but as a specific documented pattern with a paper trail and a body count of careers and dignity. The company's internal complaint resolution time dropped by 60%. Otis Groups said 71 was invited back as a paid consultant to help design the new hiring and promotion review process, a job he told his grandchildren he never expected to have and was prouder of than almost anything else in his working life. Grace Malone was still flying for the airline a year later. She had by then been promoted to lead trainer for new cabin crew, and the first thing she taught every new class had nothing to do with safety demonstrations or beverage service. She began every single training session the same way, with a story about a boarding pass she had almost failed to believe, and a lesson she said she would carry for the rest of her career, that the easiest mistake in the world to make is choosing the version of the truth that causes you the least trouble in the moment, and that the cost of that mistake always lands on someone else. Elijah Cross still flies the way he always did, quietly, without an announcement, in a hoodie, gone soft at the elbows, and boots worn thin at the toes. His mother recovered from her surgery and lives in a small house outside Nashville that he visits a few months, usually in the same worn jeans, usually he carrying the same canvas duffel. He still wears his father's old steel watch, the one engraved on the back with 2 letters and a year, a reminder, he says, of exactly where he started and exactly how easy it still is for the world to forget to look twice. Respect was never supposed to be conditional on who turns out to be standing in front of you. That's the whole of it. That's the entire lesson, and it costs nothing before someone has to teach it to you the hard way. If you had been sitting in that cabin, in row 3 or row 5 or all the way back in coach, watching a man be told to disappear for a second that roughly his, would you have said something? Or would you have looked down on your phone the way so many people did and told yourself it wasn't your place to get involved? That question doesn't stay on the plane. It can't waft the jet bridge net in every ordinary room you'll ever walk into, every counter you stand, every moment and someone in front of you gets treated like they don't belong before anyone bothers to check. Carry it with you. It's heavier than it looks, and it's supposed to be. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments. Have you ever watched something like this happen and stayed quiet? Because the next story I bring you might be the one that makes you wish you hadn't. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and educational purposes only. All characters, names, businesses, and events depicted are entirely fictional and do not represent any real person, living or dead, or any actual establishment. Any resemblance to real persons, organizations, or events is purely coincidental. This content is intended to explore themes of human dignity, workplace ethics, and social justice through narrative storytelling. It does not make factual claims about any individual company or institution.